quit if I start getting close to the time we need to quit. Tell me, because I may not be looking at it. So last couple of weeks we have looked at the Gospel of Matthew's birth narrative. And one of the things we saw last week in particular was that Matthew uses Scripture a lot. And we saw those 5 Scripture citations where Matthew said this was done to fulfill what was written. Some from the prophets, some from other places. He pulled one from Hosea 11, one from Micah 5, and so on and so forth. He also had a lot to do with angels, and the angels all interacted with Joseph. And Joseph was the one who sort of guided things in that gospel. Joseph is the one who spoke. Mary never said, what is that old song? Never said a mumbling word. I think that's about Jesus, but Mary never said one either. And so, you know, he has a way of presenting it. Jesus and his family are Judahites from Bethlehem. They only go to Nazareth by a roundabout way through Egypt, which is a direct flight. It's sort of like flying Delta. You got to go through Atlanta. So they went on a direct flight through Egypt up to Nazareth. And why did they go to Nazareth? No, they went to we just flipped stories. In this story, in Luke, they go to Bethlehem to be counted. In Matthew's story, they are Bethlehemites, not Nazareth people. And they only go up there because, first of all, they're fleeing Herod, who's killing the babies, and so they go to Egypt. Joseph gets a dream. Herod's dead. Long live the king. So he's headed back, has another dream. The next dream says, oh, by the way, Herod's son is the new king in Jerusalem, Judea. You might not want to go there. So they headed off to Nazareth. Herod also had a son that was king up there, but it was a different son, so maybe it was okay. And so that's how they end up in Nazareth. Matthew focuses on the Davidic descent of Jesus, that Jesus is this descendant of David, so he is a messianic type figure. He focuses on Jesus is like Moses. Joseph, Jesus' father, is like Joseph in the Old Testament. He has dreams, and so on and so forth. And so that's Matthew's presentation. We come to Luke, and there are a few facts that are the same in the stories. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, virgin birth, ends up in Nazareth, father and mother are Mary and Joseph. So we got Jesus, Mary, Joseph, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. That's about all that's in common between the two stories. So Luke likes to quote scripture as well, but he quotes different scriptures and he has a different point of view. If Matthew is starting with Jesus as the king, Luke starts with him as a lowly peasant. Very different. And if we think back to the time of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, there were 2 kingdoms. We often get it mixed up, and part of that is because after the first kingdom, after the northern kingdom died, shall we say, in 700 and something BCE, the southern kingdom sort of co-opted the name. And so even though they were Judah, they all of a sudden rewrote the story and they talked about all Israel. And so they kind of rewrote it. And so it's hard for us when we hear Israel, we think of the whole thing, because that's the way it gets told later. But it's really told through the eyeglasses of the people in the south. The northern kingdom had its own traditions. It was the stronger of the 2 nations, at least up until the time that it died, when the Assyrians squashed it. The stronger of the 2 nations. It had kings as well. You may remember Jezebel. Remember Jezebel? Know that name? My grandfather was a very conservative, sort of fundamentalist, Assembly of God type person. And he was always talking about not being a pain in Jezebel. And Jezebel was the wife of Ahab. Ahab was probably a pretty important leader in the northern kingdom. He had lots of chariots. He fought with the Assyrians. But because he had chariots, the people who wrote the Bible didn't think he was a very good guy because he had chariots. And also he married a foreign woman, and oh my gosh, that just did him in. Old Jezebel. And so there were prophets that opposed him, and the prophet that primarily opposed him was known as Elijah. You've all heard of Elijah. Elijah and the chariot of fire and all of that. Well, Elijah and his successor Elisha, those two prophets were the models for the stories about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel that we have that was written. Mark tells all kinds of stories about Jesus, and they're really Elijah and Elisha stories. Raising children from the dead, casting out lepers, demons, cleansing lepers, all of those sorts of things. Those are Elijah and Elisha stories, and Mark models Jesus after these northern prophets who, oh, by the way, were opposed to the king. Now, Luke has picked up on that tradition as well, and so we're going to see some of that today. But let's begin with Luke's introduction. I always love this introduction and don't want to pass up an opportunity to do it. Most narratives in the Bible are written in the third person. He did this, she did that, right? Luke has most of his gospel and most of the book of Acts, which seem to come from the same person or group, are written in the third person, but there's a few first-person narratives, and he starts his gospel with the first-person narrative. It's a wonderful technique, and I didn't put it on your paper, so you'll either have to follow along, or if you have a Bible, you can open it to Luke 1. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on by those who from the very beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything very carefully from the first, to write an orderly account for you. Now, what has he just done? He said, look, everybody's doing this. Gospels, they're the new thing. Lots of people are writing them. So I decided to write one too. But I investigated everything very carefully, and he uses technical language of a first century historian. Now, mind you, they're not writing history like our historians would write it. It's very loose, and there's all kinds of things going on in there. But he's writing it sort of like Herodotus or one of the ancient historians who wrote these grand narratives. And he writes like that, and he uses language that refers to those types of works. And he says, I've investigated everything very carefully. I'm a great scholar, right? I did it.
Yes, I am.
So I have done all of that, and after investigating everything very carefully from the first, I decided to write an orderly account for you, a history. Like Herodotus, no brag, just fact, he says. For you, most excellent Theophilus. Who's Theophilus? We don't know. He might not have even existed. Theophilus means lover of God. So it may be a kind of if you're going to write in the first person and you want to have an addressee, he may have just sort of put that in there as a way of, allowing us to see this, but also getting in that God-fearer, God-lover kind of idea. So, you, most excellent Theophilus, this just flipped on me, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. See what he just did there? Others have written these things. I wrote so that you might know the truth. Right? Maybe the others didn't really get it right, but I can guarantee mine's right? So Luke has an interesting way of doing it. It makes you feel like, what is it that Colbert calls it? Truthiness. It makes you feel like there's a little truthiness to Luke's account. And so he kind of writes it in a particular way. Now, when we get to the text, and I'm going to skip around, I have an outline here on the one that says Luke 1:5 to 2:22, 252 at the top of the page, that side. There's a brief outline, and you can see that one of the things Luke does after that little introduction of 4 verses that we just read is he has enunciations. What's an enunciation? Yeah, a visit from an angel who announces something that's going to happen, something really important. And so there are 2 of those, one to Mary and one to Elizabeth. Remember, they're cousins in this account, And so John the Baptist becomes Jesus's, second cousin or something like that. Now, mind you, that's only in Luke. The other Gospels don't say anything about that. No Elizabeth, no Mary's cousin, no father of John the Baptist. He just comes out of the desert wearing camel skins and eating locusts and, behaving generally like a wild man. That's John the Baptist in the other stories. In this story, there's a whole backstory to it that we take from Luke, but it's not found anywhere else. And you can't, if you go read those other Gospels, you probably shouldn't read this material into those. Even though Luke swore up and down that he was telling the truth. It may be different than other people's truths. Let's just put it that way. So, there's two stories, one about John, one about Jesus. There's the visit, in which Mary and Elizabeth visit each other, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And there's the birth stories, the birth of Jesus, the birth of John. Both of them are circumcised, following the Torah, following tradition, and their childhoods are briefly mentioned at the end of the story. And they're fairly elaborate stories, there's a longer outline, but I didn't want to go into it because I was trying to get all this on one page. So notice his scriptural allusions. Matthew quoted them directly, and he told us he was quoting them directly. He had that little formula. This was done to fulfill what was written. Luke doesn't inform us that he's referring to the Old Testament. He alludes to it. So if you know Scripture in and out, which many of his readers did, they would recognize these stories. But he doesn't cite it. He doesn't say, as it said in 1 Samuel chapter 1, right? Or as it was written by the prophet. He doesn't say that. He alludes to the story and they inform his stories. And so one of the things he does is he follows the story of Samuel. Samuel was a northern prophet. Even though he anointed David in the south, he's basically a northern figure. He hangs out in the north. He's this northern kingdom prophet. And Samuel's mother, Hannah, was a barren woman. And so he gets a lot of mileage out of this. Luke manages to get two different birth stories out of one story. He goes back to the Samuel story. You remember the Samuel story? Samuel's mother couldn't have children, or hadn't had children, or whatever the deal was. She had a sister wife. They had those then, apparently. And her husband had lots of children with a sister wife, and she didn't have any children. Her husband was a priest. He went and did his duty in the temple, the Shiloh temple, not the Jerusalem temple. So he did all of these sorts of things, and she was really bothered because, of course, as Karen told you a couple of weeks ago, that was the whole deal. If you didn't have children as a woman, my gosh, God hadn't smiled on you, and it was your fault. You must have done something wrong, right? God must be punishing you. So she's praying. Anyway, long story short, she finally gets this word from the priest that she too will be fulfilled. And so she becomes pregnant, has a child. The barren woman conceives. It's an old motif in the Old Testament. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, barren woman. There's some question about Rachel. Rachel is the favorite wife of Jacob, the mother of Joseph, Jacob's favorite child. Well, that only happened in Joseph's old age Jacob's old age and Rachel's old age. And so there were a number of these stories that get picked up. Well, Hannah's got the same story. And Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, again, is an older woman, not having children, concerned that it'll never happen. Her husband doesn't think it'll happen, and when the angel tells the husband about it, he kind of scoffs at it, remember? And Zechariah was struck speechless until the baby was born. So we've got these sort of stories, and Luke manages to kind of allude to this story in Samuel about Hannah, and it's sort of like Elizabeth's story. Elizabeth, like Hannah, right, so tells this whole story. But then, just when we think we're getting comfortable with Elizabeth is like Hannah, Samuel's mother, then we get Mary comes along. Mary, this young woman, and the angel appears to her and tells her about her child and that birth and that she will name it and so on and so forth. And then she responds. I want to look at the way Hannah responded after her child was born, when she got news about her child. I want to read Hannah's song, if you will, her prayer, her poem, her speech, and then we'll look at Mary's. And one of the things we're going to find out about this gospel, when we looked at Matthew, we found that Matthew explained this unusual birth by alluding to unusual women. Rahab, remember? Rahab, the one who hung the scarlet thread out the window at Jericho. Ruth, Tamar, all of these interesting women who had all of these questionable relationships. Those get into the genealogy, and Matthew uses those as a way to say, well, you know, it may have been very unusual with Mary. That doesn't mean God wasn't at work, because in those stories in Scripture, God was at work. So Luke does something different. Luke models Mary's song, prayer after Hannah. So let's read Hannah's. Here we are. Let's read Hannah's, starting with 1 Samuel 2, verse 1. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord." Remember what we just heard from Mary? My soul magnifies the Lord. Uses a different word, but the same flavor. My heart exults in the Lord. Close up a little bit. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies. What's deride? You use that word every day, don't you?
Yes.
It kind of says bad things against them, right? My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. Notice the word victory there. There is no one holy like the Lord, no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. We find that language about God being a rock in the Psalms. We find it in Isaiah. It's a fairly common motif, a common tradition. So she's talking about the strength of God and how God has done these great things for her. There is no one holy like the Lord, no one beside you, no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. Talk so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. We'll have to figure out who she's talking about here. But she's basically saying, back off, Jack, right? Calm down. Don't say those proud and haughty things. Be humble. And we're going to see why in a moment. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken. The bows of the mighty are broken. What kind of language are we reading? Talking about warfare. The bows of the powerful, the warriors, are broken. Beat your swords into plowshares, that kind of thing. Those strong soldiers that threaten us, their bows are broken. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for food. What in the world is that all about? People who were satisfied, who had plenty to eat, who had abundant food on their farms, who were wealthy in their own right, they have hired themselves out for food. They're in trouble. But what about those who were already starving? What happened to them? But those who are hungry are fat with spoil. It's reversal. The ones with the bows, they're broken. The ones who were feeble, they're strong. The ones who were full are now hungry. And the ones who were hungry are now full. The barren has borne 7, but who has many children is forlorn. And remember, this is a woman who was barren and now has children. The promise of Samuel. And of course, her sister wife wasn't very nice to her. Kind of made fun of her for being a barren woman. So she's, it's a little, contextually it has some teeth to it. She's kind of poking her finger at her sister wife, if you will. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. What's Sheol? Well, not exactly hell. That's a later concept, and we especially got it later from Milton, who expanded on it a lot. It's the the land of the dead, shall we say. People are basically shadows. They don't really have a real life, but that's kind of where they go to be a shadow. You don't die, you just sort of fade away and become a shadow in Sheol. And so this says God takes them down to Sheol, but also raises them up to life. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. God brings low, God also exalts. God raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. There's a class of psalms in the Bible that are called Lament Songs. And a lament psalm is about someone who is down and out. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, or like Jonah, I went down into the ocean, under the depths. The weeds were wrapped around me. I was going down for the last time. And that's the kind of language here. We're talking about someone who just feels like life has dealt them a blow, and they cannot get up again. They're done for. They're in the dust. They're needy. They're poor. They don't have enough to eat. Their children are starving to death. They're fleeing Afghanistan, or whatever common thing we want to think about today. These are people that are in trouble, and it says God raises them up. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. Remember, this was a time when they thought of the earth as kind of a flat thing, and it was held up by mountain pillars. And as we talked about last month, one metaphor for those pillars is that they were justice and righteousness, meaning if justice collapses, the world order collapses. Well, here it's not picking up on justice and righteousness, even though that's a theme in this text, but it talks about God setting the world on the pillars. For the pillars of the earth belong to the Lord. And it uses the personal name for God that is no longer pronounced in Judaism, but it uses that personal name for God at that point. It says, these pillars belong to this God, our God, the God of Israel. On them, God has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked will be cut off in darkness. For not by might does one prevail. I was just reading a little story today, I don't know if it was an opinion piece, but it was talking about all of these political figures that now have come out with Christmas cards in which their family is fully armed, right? This text sort of doesn't really support that, does it? He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, the wicked will be cut off in darkness, for not by might does one prevail. There's a place in Psalm 33, the king is not saved by his mighty army. And so there's a theme running through the Bible. It's not, that part of the Bible is not pacifist, but it also isn't armed to the teeth, we survive by our military might. We survive by relying on God. And if you've got somebody who's so poor that they're in the dust, people are trampling on them, how do they survive? Not by getting a secret shipment of Uzis. They survive by turning to God, and God intervenes. And that's basically what this story is all about. And it's a story about someone who feels that they're in trouble. And Hannah kind of, I think, this language, she's thinking of her past and this time when she was barren, but it also is a word for Israel. It's a word for the people. We are sometimes poor and impoverished, and there are those who are rich and wealthy and full and haughty and lifted up and exalted. And she says, God will turn that upside down. The Lord, his adversary, shall be shattered. The Most High will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. And Luke might have liked that term, because what is the word anointed in Hebrew? Messiah, Mashiach. And what is it in Greek? Christos, Christ. So, exalt the power of his Christ. is the way Luke probably read it. Because after all, Luke's using the Greek translation here of the Hebrew Bible. And so he's picking up on those things. But when we read that story, we say, okay, well, that's interesting. That's interesting for Hannah. You know, and that was a long time ago, 3,000 years maybe, give or take. A long time ago, and lots of warfare going on, and who knows what all else, and people were poor and impoverished, and that's a really nice tale. But what does it have to do with Jesus, and what does it have to do with Mary? Well, let's read on, and we'll find out. Because we love that wonderful little meek, mild, you know, we describe her as a teenager. We don't know that she was, it doesn't say, just like the donkey and the camel. It's not in the story, but we're sure that we're right. And so Mary, this young, meek little girl, young, meek, young woman who is now having a baby, and we think of her as, oh, Mary, we even use that language, mother mild, right? Mary, mother mild. It's in our songs and in our hymns. Round young virgin, right? Mother and child. And yet, let's read Mary's story after she has heard from Gabriel, after she's heard about Jesus, her child is going to be born. Let's hear what she has to say. Remember, Luke has modeled one cousin, Elizabeth, after Hannah, as the barren woman can't have children and suddenly she has children. But he also models Mary after Hannah. It's kind of a twofer. He gets two different metaphors, allusions from one character in the Bible, but it gets him two characters in his story. And Mary said, my soul magnifies the Lord. Remember Hannah, my soul exalts the Lord. And my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. So far, it's got allusions, but it doesn't sound too radical. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him. From generation to generation, he has shown strength with his arm. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the strong right arm is a symbol of power. And we don't always quite pick up on it, but it's almost like military power. Someone who has a strong right arm, they're the ones that can come in and do damage. And it's often in the Hebrew Bible ascribed to God. God is the God of power. And this is a power illusion. His strong right arm, Mary says, let's see, I just lost it.
52.
Thank you. He has shown strength with his arm, 51, has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. Starting to sound like Hannah, isn't it? About the proud. You who are so very proud, right? Stop it. Scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. So the kings of battle, they're falling, and the people who are in the dust are being lifted up. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. So Luke is using somewhat different language, but the same themes, the same allusion. The powerful will be brought down. Those who are full, and why are they full? Because they're wealthy. And where do they get their wealth? The implication is by taking advantage of their position and misusing their trust. So the rich shall be sent away empty, and he's filled the hungry with good things. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and his descendants forever. So Luke is clearly calling on the Hebrew Bible. And Mary remained with her, Elizabeth, about 3 months and then returned to her home. There's an artist who's done this image of Mary in the Magnificat, and we've normally got the meek, mild Mother Mary and maybe candles and, a little baby and Silent Night, all those kinds of images. And this person has taken this story and read it as it was intended to be read, as a story of revolution in a way. There's a total reversal. And so the Mary in that story, she's radical. She's armed to the teeth. She's ready to go. She's talking about revolution and turning the world upside down. How? Not because individuals revolted, but because God intervened on their behalf of the poor and lowly, on behalf of the hungry, on behalf of the meek. Now, we didn't expect that when we read this story, because we're more focused on these kinds of stories. Stories with the camels and the animals and the shepherds and the fields. Luke does that, but there's another edge to that story that we've often read out of it. When Luke starts his story, right after he gets through with, I'm telling you the truth, no, nothing but the truth, and it's only me that, by the way, that can tell you this truth, he begins the story and he says, in the days when Herod was king of Judah. When Herod was king of Judea. It's a dating formula, so that if you write an ancient story and you want to talk about what year it was, you don't say, well, it was 2021. You might say it was the first year of the ruler, or the whatever year of the ruler. So he's putting it in a context, but it also starts out by talking about Herod the king. What do we know about Herod the king? Not a very good guy. Had a lot of violence, a lot of power, a lot of excess. He had palaces all over the region. He had one in Bethlehem, just outside of Bethlehem, the Herodian. He had one on the other side of the Dead Sea in Jordan. He had one on the very edge of the Dead Sea. He had one up north. He had palaces all over the place. They were fortified. They were armed to the teeth because he was always worried about somebody overthrowing him. And they were elaborate. They had frescoes on the wall, and they had tiled floors, and they had mosaics, and they had elaborate kinds of things. Herod was a man of, shall we say, excess. And so when Luke tells this story, and he starts off by saying, Herod was the king, that's, that conjures up an image. But what's the other piece of this beyond Herod? Why was Herod king? The Romans had put him in power. Now, Herod was Herod had a way of figuring out how to seize power, but it was his patron, Caesar Augustus, who had put him in power. And that's the backdrop to this story. It's a time when wealth is being funneled away from the peasant farmer, up to the people who control things, up to the people who are friends of Caesar Augustus, who managed to get larger and larger estates, so that now the poor farmer who owned their little piece of land, well, there's taxes, and oh, by the way, you don't own that land anymore. Now you can be a tenant farmer, you can rent from me. There's some extra fees involved, and oh, gee, apparently you don't have the fees. Well, now you're a day laborer. You don't even have a farm to rent. You have to go out and wait on the street corner for somebody to come and hire you. That's the story of the first century. It's the story of Palestine, and who killed Jesus? The Romans. So part of what Luke is doing, he's a little careful here, a little cagey, because he does it by quoting Hannah's prayer, and has Mary sort of allude to Hannah's prayer. So he doesn't really come out and point the finger at the Romans. He talks about Herod, who's been dead for 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 years by the time he gets around to writing this story. But he has a way of framing this that reminds you this is a time when there are people that are down and lowly in the dirt who don't have enough food to eat. One of the things that's been done with sarcophaguses, sarcophagi. Do you know what a sarcophagus is? It's a bone box. So they had a practice for about 100 years, or maybe a little longer, that occurred in Palestine. Secondary burial. It's still practiced to this day in some places. If you go through the rural countryside of Greece, you'll see a little box up at the side of the road where we might have a mailbox. They have a little box. It's got their ancestors' bones in it. And so a year after the body has been left in a tomb to kind of rot. They bleached the bones in wine and then put the bones in a little bone box. Well, they did that in the first century. And so by looking at the bones in the bone boxes, in the sarcophagi, archaeologists and scientists have discovered that people were malnourished in the first century. And not just poor. The people that were in the elaborate sarcophagi that have all the fancy decorations on the side, they were malnourished too. There wasn't enough food to eat. And so when Luke says the poor shall be filled and the rich shall be brought down, he's talking about what's going on in this first century. He's talking about people who are impoverished. And that's our nice little nativity story. That's what he's talking about. And it's important, it's powerful, and it reminds us that God is about justice, even in our nice little story about Jesus. And so we read these stories and we sometimes forget, or we have a way of putting a veneer over them. We've recently started saying debts instead of sins in the Lord's Prayer, right? Because when Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer, it says the word debt, not sin. And sin has a way of saying, well, it's really about guilt and sin and so on and so forth. Debt reminds us that it's about having enough wealth to survive. Forgive us our debts, our economic debt, as we forgive our debtors. And what's the one just before that? Give us this day our daily bread. That's not a spiritual bread. It's about having enough to eat so that you're not starving to death and so that don't end up malnourished in that sarcophagus. You should be so lucky as to have a sarcophagus, right? So it's these stories are powerful, and Luke is theologizing. It's his Christology, it's his understanding of Jesus, but it's his understanding of what's really at stake here. Luke's pretty careful not to antagonize the Roman Empire too much, but he kind of does this in a way without talking about the Roman Empire, but we all know they're living in the empire. And who's in charge of the empire? It's not Jesus' people. It's not Luke's people. It's somebody else. And what are the implications of that? Wow. They don't have enough to eat. They don't have enough to pay their bills. They don't have enough to survive being crushed by the powerful and the wealthy. And so Luke picks up this story, this song, if you will, from Hannah back in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 2. And he brings it in, and he has Mary say this story right after she's heard that she's going to be the mother of the Christ child. Right afterwards. That's her immediate response is, wow, this is about justice. And not just justice from my sister wife who made fun of me, she gets a little dig in there, but justice in general. This is about our people having enough to survive, to live, to eat, to be able to thrive in this world. And that's her reaction to the news that she's going to be the mother of Jesus. And it's not the way we think about it a lot of times, because we want to think about Jesus as this peace-loving character who, never said a mumbling word on the cross, and right, and so on and so forth. But Luke reminds us, if we read it carefully, that there's a lot at stake here. And on Christmas Eve, when we sing Silent Night and we have all those wonderful thoughts, there's also a reminder that the Christian story, the biblical story, the story that goes back to the Torah, is a story about God caring for those who cannot care for themselves. And about our responsibility to do what we can to live out that call of God for us to lift up the lowly. I don't know what time it is, but 4:40, we can quit a little early today since we've got the other service. What kinds of comments or questions have you got?
Well, I guess one of my thoughts is Christ basket
Yeah.
was to save them, but not necessarily the spiritual saving of them. It was more literal because of who was in power.
It was both.
And so
yeah.
okay, so people then, in part was how they perhaps turned on Christ because he wasn't fulfilling that part of things. I realize that's a very...
Well, we don't know exactly what happened because there's a lot of filters when we read the Gospels. There's a lot of filters between us and Jesus. But in the Gospels we have, one of the things he does just before he gets killed, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he goes to the temple and he upsets the economic system. You know, we think of a temple as sort of another word for church, and it's the place where you go to pray. And it's not to say they didn't pray at the temple, but they were sacrificing animals. And you came to town, maybe you lived out in the village someplace, 20 miles away, 30 miles away, and you came to town and you wanted to sacrifice. Well, you couldn't bring your own animal. Where did you get it? Well, there were approved vendors, shall we say, who had the animals that were raised in the right way and killed in the right way and, could do all the right things, who were glad to sell you the animal. And you had a temple tax you had to pay once a year, a half silver shekel, Tyrian shekel. You couldn't just pay it with whatever money you had, assuming you had money. Remember, we just kind of talked about the economic situation. And where do you get that approved shekel? Well, you have to exchange money with the money changers, and they're taking a little cut of that. And who owned that process? The high priestly families owned it. So, and it's not an anti-Jewish story. It's an anti-high priestly story who are taking advantage of it. And so it's that kind of a story. And so Jesus does that, and right? Because the temple was the economic engine of Jerusalem. It's where stuff happened. It's where you went to trade money, to do this, to do that. Lots of things are going on and surrounding this temple. This is an economy that is only gradually monetizing. Right? It had been a barter economy not too long before, and it still was largely a barter economy, but it was monetizing rapidly because people were moving around, Romans are involved, and so monetizing had advantages over, if I'm going to trade you with sheep every time we have to exchange goods, well, that's fine if we live in a village someplace, but what if we live in the city? You might not have a sheep. So you monetize it, but in the process of monetizing, some people do better than others, right? And so part of what's going on, he was killed in part because he was suggesting things that were a little radical. And that ticked off the Romans for a couple of reasons. One is you're questioning the system, but a second piece of that is you're maybe encouraging people to revolt. Yeah, they're gathered there. Theoretically, this is a Passover season. Is what the story tells us. Whether that's true or whether it's a metaphor for Jesus is the Passover lamb, we don't know. But Passover was a time when riots happened. And why did they happen? Because Passover was a time when people were called to go to Jerusalem, make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So you got lots of people there, lots of hungry people, lots of unhappy people, lots of people who aren't very happy about the Romans controlling things, and things could get out of hand. And Pilate was known to crush people during Passover. Other Roman governors were willing to do that as well. And so we have hints, we don't know, because there's so many layers between us. But one of the things that's happened is not only are the gospel layers there, but there's 2,000 years of church layers there. When the church went from being the downtrodden in the culture to being the religion of the Roman of Europe, and became the religion of power, some things changed. And so, well, don't question power too much, because we're in power now, right? So there were a lot of things that happened, and we don't read it that way anymore. Yeah. Yes.
Talk about the timing of Luke's story, when it was written, and when somebody might have experienced the story or not until he wrote it, that it existed.
Yeah, it's well, number one, I think Luke and Matthew stories are metaphors. They're metaphors for their theology, their understanding of Jesus. So I don't know that we can get back to the events in the story. But when did Luke write that? That's a good question. The theory of New Testament scholarship is that Matthew and Luke used two common sources. One was the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel written. The other was a saying source that were things like parables and other pithy little sayings that Jesus had said that had been collected. And those two sources became the sources for Matthew and Luke, working independently but using common sources. And then they had their own special stuff. So Luke's got, has this nativity story. Matthew's got his own nativity story, which is a little different, and so on and so forth. But the traditional idea about them is Matthew and Luke are both written 85 or 90 Common Era. Jesus died roughly 30, so 60 years after. Second, maybe the third generation. There's of Christians. If the first generation was in the 30s, or at least started in the 30s, by the time you get to say 90, you're quite a bit later. A generation or two has elapsed, so there's that. The other thing is that some New Testament scholars would put Luke even later. They would find Luke writing around 110 or 120, so another generation later, at the point when things are beginning to change in who the early Jesus movement is. It went from being this sort of little sect in Judaism in Palestine, right? At the time of Jesus, they were all Jews, and they didn't advocate not being Jews. Jesus wasn't the first Christian, and even his followers weren't the first Christians. They were Jews who believed in the way. And as things changed over time, Luke's writing probably to a Gentile audience. He's very well educated. He's very fluent in Greek literature and Greek rhetoric and Greek history and lots of those sorts of things. Probably writing in a city. And remember, Jesus comes out of a village culture. So a lot of Jesus's parables are about animals and crops and that kind of culture. Luke and Paul, to the extent that Paul went from city to city in Turkey and Asia Minor and into Greece and eventually Rome, they're working in cities, and they're working with a different group of people, a different culture, and that's probably what Luke's writing to. So I see Luke as probably early 2nd century. The church is organized differently. It's probably no longer, it's got a different theology than it did in 30 when Jesus was there. And does that help?
Yeah, I was just trying to imagine how he was thinking of it. He personally was experiencing the Roman Empire. It was after the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, well, and pretty much the whole New Testament, with the exception of a few of Paul's letters, is written post-70 Common Era, which is the year that the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And that had major implications. That Jewish community in Jerusalem got obliterated. They either left or they died. James, the brother of Jesus, was sort of the head of that group. He was killed by at the behest of a high priest that didn't like him in Jerusalem, stoned to death. And so there were a number of things like that, and that whole movement sort of shifted and changed. Now, I think that in the cities there is some wealth. Luke's in touch with some people that have some means, but there's other people that don't have means. And the church, I think, is a big tent at that point. It's got people all over the map. It's got some recent immigrants, shall we say. People were moving around. They were moving from a village culture into a city because that's where jobs were. And why were jobs there? Well, the Romans have forced their people off of the farms and the villages, and so they got to go someplace. And so they were ending up in the city. And so I think part of his people had means. The majority of the church, I don't think, did. He's pretty careful in most of the gospel not to poke the finger in the eye of the empire. But this stretch, he's pretty clear that that's something to think about. Why that's so different than the rest of the gospel, I don't know. These nativity stories seem to have their own origin, and they're connected to the gospels, but they're almost independent in some ways. Yes?
Could you just talk a minute about the heavenly host, please?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
So, in chapter 2 of the gospel, when the birth has happened in the city and there's shepherds in the fields, remember, Jesus was probably not born in a little wooden stable, but at least in this story, not born in a little wooden stable, but in something like a cave where the animals were kept. But out in the field were the shepherds, and the shepherds are, they're out there hanging out, and all of a sudden the angels start showing up, and things get crazy. And the story talks about the heavenly host. In the Hebrew Bible, it's Adonai, Lord, Sabaoth, which means host, but what's a host? It's not like in the Catholic Church where it's the body of Christ, the little wafer. It's the army, the heavenly armies that God is in charge of. And so the heavenly host is, God's mighty army of angels who are there to kind of keep the world working properly, but also to intervene on behalf of the poor. Intervene on behalf of God's people who might be oppressed by someone. And so, yeah, it's a, we don't like to think in that language. And part of that had to do with the culture in which they lived, There were lots of wars and lots of people killed in those wars. So in the Old Testament, you might have 90% or 100% casualty rates when the Assyrians came to town. Syria was where Iraq is today. So the people from Iraq, when they sent their armies, if you opposed them, they didn't take any prisoners. They just obliterated everybody. And so there's that kind of language because there's so much stuff going on, and the Bible sort of adapts that as well. So it talks about heavenly armies, really. We don't like that. That sounds a little too violent for us, so we decided to call them the hosts.
It's not the Christmas pageant picture of, little 3-year-olds
Yeah.
in that little.
Well, I don't know. I've seen some 3-year-olds that.
Well, I experienced 3-year-olds who could be in the army, but.
Yeah. Like the ones that you had where they hyperventilated.
Oh.
Okay, so other comments, questions, observations?
Well, just that when we look at the Magnificat, we're not really talking about Mary, we're talking about Luke and his thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you have to remember that.
Well, sure, but I also think when we're talking about Mary without that, we also may not be talking about Mary, but our own incarnation of Mary. We have imagined in our traditions all of how these people function. Peter's the big dumb fisherman, right? Well, maybe. But that's one Gospel's version. The other is, you're the rock on which I built my church. And so, yeah, it's Luke's Mary isn't necessarily the Mary we have to think about tonight. But it's good to remember that there's a lot going on in this story. Yeah, I don't want you to think that that you have to adopt this militant justice framework is the only way to view the Bible. Just know that it's there and there were reasons for it. Sure. Okay, let's close in prayer, and then we can get ready for our own version of Christmas Eve. God of glory, God who comes to us in so many different ways and reminds us of our smallness in the face of your magnificence, who reminds us, however, of our ability to do the right thing, to be your people, to be on the side of those who cannot help themselves, and to stand with us as we go forth in this world to be better people and to make the world a better place. In your name we pray, amen.